If you don't know me, my name is Si Munsey. I'm part of the team here. I get to lead this wonderful Sight of Life church. And I want to thank you for coming and making the time to be here this morning. Now, if you've been around for a few weeks, you'll know that recently I opened a sermon on a Sunday morning with a highly contentious debate about whether it was called breakfast, lunch and dinner or breakfast, dinner and tea. Some of you still haven't forgiven me, and so you need to come to Jesus about that stuff. And we'll find out who I've really offended because we've got a crew night when we talk about our members in a few days, so we'll find out who's still with us. But we've got another divisive issue that I need to talk about, okay? And there's a picture on the screen, and what I would like you to tell me is what colour or what colours this dress is, okay? I've got a blue and black down here, lilac and grey, white and green, lilac and black. It's clearly white and gold. That's yeah, exactly. I know, highly contentious, right? But it's in my opinion, this is white and gold. Now, this did the rounds on the internet a little while ago, and it went crazy, and people fell out about stuff, which is surprising on the internet. I know it hardly ever happens, but that's what happened, and I would say that this was white and gold. But if you flick to the next slide. Now, this is it in sunlight and in shade. This dress is actually blue and black. I know. It's actually blue and black. So if you saw blue and black, you can feel very smug about yourselves. But it looks completely different, doesn't it? Right, next one, there's another of these. What colours do you see on here? Pink and green, pink and white, grey and sort of turquoisey teal. Okay. Again, there's clearly there's a domestic going on there between the Wilsons. Okay, so again, let's flick to the next slide. Now, I don't think this one completely clears it up because it's a projector, but this is a pink and white shoe. Okay, it is pink and white, I promise you. Now, quick, flick to the next slide before we all fall out. Now, how you see things affects how you view it or what you do with it, doesn't it? So, for example, if you were looking for a white and gold dress to go to a wedding or something like that, and you saw that one and you'd ordered it off the internet, you'd think, brilliant, I'm getting a perfect thing here. And then it arrives and it's blue and black. You'd be very disappointed. Same thing with the shoes. And it would change your opinion of it, really, wouldn't it? And so we're going to look today because the view that we have on stuff affects how we feel about it. And that happens in every aspect of life. And we're going to look at the view that Jesus had, because he had quite a different view on children and childhood to those around him at the time. And we're going to have a little look at what that looks like. So we're in Luke chapter 18. You can find that on your phone or a Bible if you want to. It is on the screen, so you can just read it up there if you want to. So the kind of the context of what's going on here is Jesus and their disciples they're on their way to Jerusalem, to kind of the culmination of it all. Jesus is heading there, but along the way they're stopping in at various places, and Jesus is doing stuff and saying stuff, and that's what we have recorded in the Gospels. And in this particular instance, they're stopped somewhere. It's probably a village that's, like I say, along the way, and Jesus' reputation has suitably spread because they're coming to him. They've heard of him as a great teacher, as this rabbi, and his reputation has spread around the region. And so, then it says in Luke 18, verse 15, now they were bringing even infants to him that he might touch them. And when the disciples saw it, they rebuked them. But Jesus called to them, saying, let the children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it. Now, this is a fairly remarkable sequence of events, and kind of, even as we look at it today, this is a strange kind of scene in some ways, but in the time, it was even more remarkable than maybe we would have had it today. And like I say, the way that we view things affects how we feel about them. And there's a view in here, there's a few characters going on. There's a view of the parents who are bringing their children to Jesus. They've decided that it's worth their time to take their children to this guy for him to bless them. And that was like a thing in the culture. You'd take it to a learned rabbi and they'd bless them, put their hands on them and give them a blessing. And in the time of when this is written, choosing to do anything other than working the fields or tending the sheep or looking after the home was a choice against earning some money or spending your time doing the thing that keeps your family going. And so they've made a kind of a value decision here. It's a choice that costs them in some way. There's also the view of the disciples, isn't there? They've decided that the children are absolutely not worth Jesus' time. They've said, no, don't bother him. And then there's Jesus' view. And we will get to that in a few minutes. And we all have views on stuff. You have views on all sorts of things. I have views on all sorts of things, like the dress and like the shoe. You'll have different views on politics, on the monarchy, on sports, on food. You'll have different views on church. You'll all have different views about me. You'll have different views at the end of this morning about the kind of job I did on this. And you'll have views about children. You'll have your own views about individual children. You'll have your own views about your children or other people's children. You'll have views on children as a whole. The older you get, the more you find yourself saying stuff like the children of today. Yeah, people are laughing because it's true. And you shocked yourself when you said it for the first time and realized you sounded like your mother. But we all have views. And none of us, like I say, none of us don't have a view, and we all believe our view is correct. Otherwise, we wouldn't hold it, would we? We'd change it. That's how stuff happens. And we hold a view that seems to make the most sense to us. And it's worth examining our own view of children, because Jesus here tells us that unless we become like them, we cannot be part of the kingdom of heaven, or we cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. That's a pretty serious thing to say, isn't it? And so if we've all got these different views, we need to try and make sure that somehow it's aligned to what his view is, because otherwise we end up trying to become something that he's not wanting us to become like, and we miss the whole point. But it's almost certain that our view of children is not the same as the disciples in this passage, or even the parents in this passage. In fact, it's unlikely that even across this room we all have the same view of children and childhood. So if I was to ask someone in this room what makes a child, there'd be all sorts of different answers. There'd be some answers that are based on age. So children are up to this point. There'd be some answers that are based on maturity. There are some answers that would be based on whether they're allowed to legally work. That would be a view for some people. Or even according to like clothing manufacturers, there's a point where children stop being children. So for example, James Hatcher, who still can buy large children's t-shirts and avoid the tax on them, would be classed as a child by clothing manufacturers. But Esther wouldn't see him in the same way. But it's important to look at these different things. We have different views. And so what you view as a child may well be different to what Jesus has in mind. So glad James isn't in the room. You can all tell him later. But we need to be humble before the text of the Bible and before what Jesus is saying to be able to kind of look at it through what the Bible says rather than bring our own subjective view to it. We're going to do a little bit of sociology and psychology because it's important. There's a lady called Mary Jane Kahili, and she is a professor of childhood studies, which even as a field of study didn't exist 150 years ago, but it does now, and she's a professor in it. She said this: childhood is not universal. Rather, it is a product of culture, and as such will vary across time and place. So according to UNICEF, a child is anyone below the age of 18. That's something that they would apply legally. But if you go to any of our youth who are maybe 15 or 16 and say, hello, child, they might have a different view on that kind of thing. So again, comes with different viewpoints. And the concept of childhood being something up to the age of 18 is in historical terms, a very, very recent phenomenon. In fact, in the last 150 years, like I say, and so even in English thinking, sort of much further back, certainly throughout kind of the Middle Ages, anyone up to about the age of 7 was considered a child, and anyone over that wasn't. Because they could work, they could be put to work, and therefore they were actually just seen as miniature adults. That was kind of the prevalent view. They were adults, but just tiny. And so we see this in interesting places. For example, this is a Spanish prince. look at his face. And then you look at the size of the horse that he's riding and the clothing that he's wearing. And we see this in art all over the place, which is where we understand a lot of how people view children in the past. And he's just a miniature adult. Everything about him, all of his responsibilities and the way he's dressed, say adult, and yet his face is child. So we have a hard time understanding this, but they would have just been viewed, like I say, as miniature adults. So it was only about 200 years ago that they put in any restrictions on the fact that like a 9-year-old could work in factories. And it did all sorts of good things for stopping children dying prematurely. They put in child labor laws. And we would look today and think, well, absolutely. But 9? Even still, we'd think, that's crazy. But even today, in parts of the world, it's estimated that there are about 25% of children as young as 5 being put to work. It's not something that we can sort of go, well, no, that's been and gone. It might well be here in Britain, but it's not across the world. And so children as miniature adults is still a view. But it's only one view. There's another whole debate about whether children are inherently evil and just need to therefore be educated or disciplined out of that evilness. And parents around the room are thinking there are points, yes, where I could hold to that view. There's another view, though, that children are seen as inherently good, actually, and they are sweetness and they're light, and they're just actually gradually corrupted by the world around them, and therefore they need to be, rather than being educated and disciplined out of it, they need to be protected and kind of looked after from the world, protected from it. There's also a view, though, that children are just kind of, the word is innocent. They're like a blank canvas. So they just come into the world just waiting to be shaped in one way or the other. And so they're shaped by their experiences, by their nurture or otherwise, maybe from their parents, and so that they have to actively be shaped into being good people of the world. And again, we start to recognize some of our own views in how we view what children are, who they are at their very core. And I've mentioned this before, even this year, but in the world's view, I think children are often ending up being either disregarded as not important in my life or in the world. They're viewed as commodities, things to kind of get me to a certain point in life where I feel like I'm making something of my life, or they're seen even as an idol, a thing to be worshipped, a thing for my whole life to be given to above all other things. Now, there's some truth in each of those things, isn't there? But if we have the wrong view of children, then when we're told to be like one by Jesus, we end up with quite a skewed view of what he's asking us to do, don't we? So, if we track through what's happening in kind of the structure of Luke, okay, so in Luke, we get this idea of the view that people had of children in Jesus' day. So in Luke 17, Jesus is telling several different stories of things that either happen in real life around him or parables of things that are going on around him. And we see him telling stories of servants, and then he heals 10 men with leprosy, then he talks about widows, and then he talks about tax collectors, and then he talks about children. Now, if you know much about biblical culture, slaves, lepers, widows, tax collectors are not the kind of high-standing people in society. And in that little gallery, Jesus puts children amongst them. Luke says these are the kind of people that Jesus comes for and comes to. And it's interesting. We're looking at a list of outcasts. We're looking at people who have no standing in society whatsoever. And so we get a hint here, don't we, of the disciples' view in the phrase that Luke uses in verse 15. He says, even infants. Not only are kind of all these people crowding around Jesus, now they're bringing even infants. Even these children. The audacity of it. You see, nowadays, it's the complete opposite, isn't it? Anytime that people go on the election trail, the politicians are out and about amongst the people. If you saw somebody with a child, the highest endorsement of a person would be, for them to allow somebody else to allow them to kiss their child on the head or to hold them. It would be like, wow, look at this guy. We should definitely have him leading the country because he can hold a small person. But it's a completely different view, isn't it? It shows us how far things have swung. But not so for the disciples. They're rebuking them. They're telling them off. And despite all of this, we're then told we need to receive the kingdom of God like a child or not enter it at all. So we have to ask the question, don't we? What does it truly mean to be a child? Is it these things we've seen? Is it just be a miniature adult? Is it kind of like do the stuff that everybody else does, but just kind of be small? Make yourself small, make yourself less in standing, but kind of just get on with things? Or are we supposed to kind of become just immature, maybe like children? Just kind of, as Christians, we're called to just check our brains out at the door and just go blindly. See, I don't think it's as simple or actually as simplistic as that. Jesus' call to each of us is to become childlike, not childish. And there's an important difference here, isn't there? See, regardless of how you view children, no matter what your upbringing has been or how your worldview has been shaped by the culture that you have been shaped by, whether you like it or not, whether you've been shaped by the media or your own predispositions, Jesus says, become like a child. And so I found this quote from an author and a pastor really, really helpful. And he said it like this. And in fact, this came up last week when Lars was talking. And it happened to fit perfectly with his points, but it was a hangover from my slides. It shouldn't have been there, but it just shows the dovetailing in the gospel. He says this: what Jesus has in mind here is an objective state that every child who has ever lived, regardless of race, culture, or background, has experienced. Helpless dependence. Helpless dependence. If there's one thing that unites children across the board, even from 200 years ago when they were being put into factories, they were helplessly dependent, even at that point, on people who should have been protecting them. Even today, people who should be protecting children. Children are helplessly dependent. And so, if you feel like you've got to have it all together before you come to Jesus, then you've actually ended up swallowing a lie about who he is. You see, if you feel that you're supposed to be like this miniature adult, you've got to work and you've got to contribute, you've got to play your part before you can come to Jesus, then you've misunderstood the grace of God, that it is a free gift that we come to him. If you feel like you're bringing something to Jesus other than just helpless dependence, then you've got a wrong view of who God is as a transcendent, holy, other than us God. He's immeasurable in his might and his power, and yet we come and think, well, I better bring something. And it kind of shows us a little bit about where we feel like we're supposed to fit in, what we're supposed to be like as children of God. And yet, he has no requirement of us other than to come as children, to come helplessly dependent. Equally, if you've ever been told that you can't come to Jesus by anyone, including that little voice in your own head that sounds a lot like you, but kind of just says stuff that isn't always that helpful. Maybe the voice is to tell you you're not good enough, you're too bad. You know, children are just all bad and therefore so are you, and you've got to get yourself sorted before you can come to him. Or maybe even the opposite way, that you kind of believe the lie that you're actually too good. I've got things all sorted. I don't need anyone else. I'm pretty good, thanks, and lots of people tell me so. Then I want you to listen to what happens when even his best friends in the whole world are doing those exact things, and they keep telling people they can't come to Jesus. Verse 16 starts with, but Jesus. So for any reason, if you feel like you can't come to Jesus this morning for any reason, of your own doing, of someone else's doing, of circumstance, then there's this but Jesus. Because the disciples are saying, no, you can't come. No, you can't come because you're small. You're too insignificant, or you're too much of an inconvenience, or Jesus won't want anything to do with you. But Jesus, and there's a retelling of this same account when Jesus then says, let the children come to me. And it's in Mark's gospel. We're told here that Jesus was indignant. It's a great word. Indignant. And the kind of where it comes from is two words that are kind of smushed together, which is a technical term in the Greek. And it means much and grief. It basically said Jesus was muchly grieved. He was indignant. It got to him. It got to him enough that whatever he was doing, he noticed this thing going on and said, no. Let them come to me. And you see, his call to you and me this morning is exactly the same as it always has been in this moment too. All those who would listen, he says, let the children come to me. Come to me, helplessly dependent. Let nothing and let no one tell you anything other than you can come to me. You see, we might have all kinds of views on children and on childhood, and we're certainly going to be skewed in some way, shape, or form by the way we've come to this, because we have subjective views on stuff. But the only one who has an objective view that's not shaped or clouded by other things is the one who creates the thing, isn't it? We're the created, he is the creator. So I imagine, for example, there's something in your houses that is not being used for its intended purpose. So there's a chair somewhere in your house that is intended to be sat on, right? And yet I imagine there's a chair in your house that never gets sat on because it's where the washing lives. There you go. Or the stuff that's just waiting to be taken upstairs. You know, the stairs are not there as a collection point for your husband's belongings, and yet that's where they live half the time. Maybe I don't know what's on top of your fridge, but I imagine the top of your fridge was not intended to have the stuff that's on top of your fridge on top of it. There's all sorts of stuff that the Creator did not have in mind for the thing that you have used it for. And yet, the objective view is the one from Jesus. And he says to children, he says to you, come to me. We're the ones with the subjective view. We're the ones that are shaped and changed by the things that have happened around us, by the things that go on in our own heads that say, well, of course you can't come to Jesus. Either I'm too good to be a child, I can't come to him like a child, or, well, I'm not even good enough to come to him like that. Both are untrue. You know, in the last couple of years as a church, we've grown in all sorts of ways, but we've grown particularly with our under 18s, children, youth. And partly that's through families joining us, partly just through people making babies. There's all sorts of ways to grow a church. But it's important for us to consider the other part of what Jesus says here, which is do not hinder them. Because I think there are actually all sorts of things that we do without sometimes knowing it and maybe sometimes with knowing it that end up being hindrances, particularly for children to come to Jesus. And I want us to just think a little bit about this today. And particularly if you're a parent here today, or one day you're hoping to be a parent, and it's absolutely vital that we hear that call from Jesus to us personally to come to him like a child. But also then for us to hear his call to let the children come to me and do not hinder them. You see, in preparing for this, I realised I actually hinder my boys from all sorts of things. I've got 3 kids, 8, 6, and 2. And sometimes I actively hinder them. So, for example, our youngest has just started riding his little balance bike to school. And sometimes I actively hinder him from going across the road on his own. Because that's a good thing to do. And so I actively do that. I choose to actively hinder him. I also hinder my children in the fact that I support Manchester United and I force them to support Manchester United, and they're not great at the moment. They haven't been great for a few years, and so that hinders them in terms of, making friends and all sorts of stuff and having joy in life. It's a hindrance, but that's just the way things are. But then I was thinking about this because actually there are other ways that I unconsciously hinder them too. So we recently moved over from Woolston over here to Shirley. Our house is just a few roads back. And in their old school, a lot of the kids there were into match attacks cards, which are like football cards, and you can play a little game with them. Loads of them were into that. I'm into football. My kids are into football. It was a happy little place to be. So they collected those. And then we moved over to Shirley. And, in fact, there you go. I was into this, so much so that I wanted to tell you that I completed the 95 sticker album. Some of you are looking thinking, well done you. I've never been more in awe. Others are thinking, what a loser. And that's fine. Like I said, we've all got subjective views. But when we moved over to Shirley, a lot of the kids there were into Pokemon cards. And that was new territory for us. I've never been into Pokemon. And so I found myself kind of actively avoiding the conversations about Pokemon. Not because I have any great theological opposition to Pokemon or any particularly strongly held views, or so I thought, but I was avoiding the kids getting into this because when I was at school, in my view, in my subjective view, it was the nerds who were into Pokemon. I know. Shocking confession before you all. And actually that confirmation, that bias was confirmed the other day when Dave McNee confirmed to me he was into Pokemon when he was a kid. And I've not even got anything mean about you, Chris, actually. It's just Dave and James, and they're not even here. But I realised I was sort of semi-conscious, but I was actively hindering them for getting into that. Now, I've realised that is not true. And if my kids want to get into Pokemon, that's fine, because then it's a good way for them to make friends and do all that sort of stuff. But I was hindering them without really even realising it. That's the point, okay? Not that Pokemon kids are nerds. That's not what you need to go away with. But if you're a parent, this is particularly pertinent for you, but it goes for all of us, in that children are watching and learning from you. They're picking up on all sorts of things. And we know that, don't we? Because often kids will come out with something and you think, well, where did that come from? And then you realise, oh, me. And it's a terrifying place to be. But for all of us, whether they're your kids or not, and particularly when we're part of a church family, you are an example, whether you like it or not. The question is, what kind of example are you? And I'm not necessarily even talking about a good or a bad example. There's all sorts of things that are going to be in your life that in the right context are good and in the wrong context are terrible. But when Jesus saw something that was hindering children from coming to him, he called it out. He didn't stand for it. In fact, he was much grieved by it, we found out, didn't we? And I just wonder whether there are some things that he wants to call out in you today. Whether there's just stuff that's going on in you personally or in us together as a body that he wants to just speak into. And like I say, some of them will be active things that you're conscious about. And others will be maybe more passive and we're currently blind to them. But by his Holy Spirit, he reveals to us the truth that we can't otherwise see. That's what God is in the business of doing. And this is not where I'm going to make you feel terrible. Okay? That's not the aim of this, because Jesus' call to us is to come to me like children. He wants us to come to him helplessly dependent. And so you can come to him helplessly dependent. It's not about how hard you try or how well you do in any of these things anyway. It never was. It never will be. And so we can come to him. But I just want us to think about these things. Because maybe for you, maybe as a parent or maybe just as someone in our church, maybe it's the time you spend with Jesus. Do your kids see that? Do your kids see you spending time with God? Or is that a separate thing? Do you share what Jesus is teaching you about with them? Or do you just grill them about what they learn in Real Life Kids each week? Do we share with them our spiritual lives? Maybe it is, in fact, our own commitment to the very bride of Christ, the very thing Jesus is coming back for one day, his church. You see, if you're here like 1 in 4 weeks, and you're here when you're on the rota, that says something to our children in the church. It says actually that this is just one of many options for where we can find our primary place of belonging. You can find it here, you can find it at football, you can find it at shopping in Tesco because it's quiet on a Sunday morning. But Jesus is coming back for this, for us. And so it communicates something to our kids, our commitment to Jesus through the church. And I'm not saying that because we need people on rotas. I couldn't give a monkeys whether you join a rota or not. I give a monkeys whether you come to Jesus or not. Maybe for you, and getting a bit more difficult, maybe it's past hurts. Maybe it's stuff that you haven't dealt with that keeps coming out, and that's what your kids see and feel. Or other kids around you in your life see and feel. The stuff that you haven't dealt with that Jesus just keeps kind of putting his finger on. Then it's stuff that either hinders you coming to Jesus as a child, or it hinders you helping others to come to Jesus as a child because you struggle to do it yourself. Jesus wants us to come to him, all of us who are weary and heavily burdened, and he will give us rest. And if you want to know how to do that, listen to last week. Maybe there's stuff in your life that's just unforgiveness. There's things in your life with somebody else, or maybe even just with yourself, that you haven't fully resolved. And it's important that we don't kid ourselves that unresolved relationship conflict doesn't have an impact on children. I'm a product of that environment where we kind of think, oh, well, that's between us, and it doesn't impact those around us. It absolutely impacts those around us. And we'd like to believe that it doesn't, but it does. You see, we can come to God with all sorts of mess. But if we hide that mess and don't let him help us, then he kind of goes, okay, you can still come to me. But every now and then, gently, kindly, he just puts his finger on something and just kindly draws us in and says, should we deal with that? I'm going to put you in a conversation with someone where they're going to say something and you're going to react because it still hurts. Can I just encourage you that if when something is touched on, it hurts, that thing's probably a wound and not a scar. Scars don't hurt, right? We still carry them around with us. I've got scars on my fingers because I can think of when I was riding my bike and I went under the flue from the boiler and it sliced my hand. I can remember that moment. Sorry for the gross moment. Even Helen flinched and she's a nurse. But I remember that. But it doesn't hurt now. Like it's a scar. But I've also had things when it's been like a wound for ages. And maybe like it's got a scab over it and it's somewhat protected, but you poke that and it hurts. Please don't poke it. But I don't know. I just wonder whether there's some people in here who feel like stuff's been dealt with, and actually, do you know what? It's still a wound and not a scar. And we can still carry those things with us in life, but Jesus wants to bring healing, and he actually wants to bring complete freedom. You see, maybe it's a relationship that is actually past restoration. Okay, that relationship is not going to be reconciled again. But you're hurt within it. That can be brought freedom. That doesn't need to bind you anymore. Maybe for you, it's just an example of the way we hinder children or the way we influence our children is how we spend our time. For example, there was some research done that showed that we touch our phones on average 2,617 times a day. That's a lot, isn't it? 2,617, and that's an average. So some of you will be above that, and you'll be feeling condemned and terrible. Some of you will be below that, and you'll be feeling smug and happy with yourself. Just think, though, for a moment, if you're a parent, if you touched your child with love and affection, just 1% of the amount of times you touched your phone in a day, that would be simply just 26 opportunities of an arm around the shoulder, a moment to show love and connection and to communicate worth and importance and being seen. What about here in church? This is maybe a bit broader for all of us, but have you ever found yourself, if you've been around for a while, have you ever found yourself kind of looking around and thinking, there's a lot of kids these days? Sometimes these worship times seem to like they're more for them than they are for me. You know, there was some research done that showed that children who were part of a church when they were children and they were integrated into the family of the church, just integrated into life, not necessarily through like particular programs or particular ways of doing stuff, they were just thought of. They were far, far more likely to grow up to be flourishing Christians as adults. And like I say, it didn't matter how they were integrated, but it did matter that they were integrated. And we've all got a part to play in that. And I want that to be challenging to us. I find it. Sometimes it would be so much easier if I was not here with my kids. I could engage in worship so much more. Sometimes I go over and preach at West End and get lost in wonder, love, and praise. And then other times I deal with, the dribble marks have gone on my shorts now, but that's just sometimes the reality. But we've all got a part to play in that. Linked to this, what about our intentionality towards helping children to understand the Christian faith? Whether as a parent or as a friend or just a part of the family member here at church. You see, I've shared this stat before, but there is a statistical likelihood that if people come to, the likelihood of people coming to faith after the age of 14 basically just does that. It literally drops off a cliff edge. And that's not to say that we don't share the gospel with people over the age of 14. But it does say, let's share the gospel with our children. Let's share the good news of Jesus as they come through. When they go out to their groups, we're not just teaching them Bible stories and doing songs and dances for the sake of it. We're introducing them to the one who has saved their souls. And we do so intentionally because it is so important, if not one of the most important things we do. But with your own children, can I just, because this is something that I've realized and I have been challenged on, have we ended up settling into a passive approach of letting our real-life kids or our youth teams bring the gospel to our children? Have we actually ended up slowly becoming a hindrance to them coming to Jesus because in our lives they only see it on a Sunday and they don't talk about Jesus around the rest of the week? So Jesus is like, he's great on a Sunday and I love my group, but he doesn't seem to be around on a Wednesday at swimming. Or he doesn't seem to be around when, like, mum's got to be here and dad's got to be there and life's a bit tricky. This is real stuff. So I'll let you in on a secret. That whole list came quite easily because that's most of the stuff that I struggle with. And there'll be different stuff for you. There'll be some of the same, some of the other stuff, but if you were preaching, like I say, your list would be different to mine because you're rubbish in different ways than I am. But we all struggle. There's no point pretending that we don't. There's no point pretending that we have the whole thing sewn up. And if your view on this hasn't been changed this morning, then either you are perfect or you're deluded. And so we need to come, like Jesus tells us, like a child, and admit our helpless dependence on him because I have no hope apart from him. I don't stand here this morning and go, okay, and here's all the answers to those problems. Here's a 3-point plan to help you as a parent to be a great example to your children in the faith. All I have is Jesus. And all you're ever going to have is Jesus. And if you're looking for something beyond him, you're never going to find it. But he says, come to me. Admit you can't do it on your own. Admit you can't do it by trying harder or being better. You see, if you have heard those things and you're thinking, I do want to be different, I do want to change. If you want your home to be like outpost of heaven, where your children can come to know Jesus as you talk to them about him, then humble yourself today and come before Jesus yourself as a child of God. Admit your helpless dependence. You see, if we want Life Church, if we want our church, because if you're here, this is us, right? Yeah, we stand up at the front and we spend time in the week making stuff, thinking about how we can do things, but it's us. Like, just look around you for a moment. It's us. If we want this to be the kind of place where children come to Jesus, then we need to take his word seriously. And we need to let the children come to him, and we need to do the same thing. We need all the little ones to come to him, whether they're little in age, whether they're little in maturity, whether they're little in the eyes of the world, and maybe even in the eyes of society, the people who are cast out and on the edge. We need to come as a child. But you know, as a child, we come to a father. It makes sense, doesn't it? But we come to a father, and the only way we come to the Father is through Jesus. It helps us to know who we are as children, and it helps us to know who he is as Father. And maybe right now that's a big old wound that I've just poked on, and you're going, ow, that still hurts. Don't talk about dad stuff. It's the same deal. We come to Jesus. You see, he said it himself like this. Jesus said it to his friend Thomas. who was probably one of those disciples who was rebuking the little children. Don't even think about coming to Jesus. And he got set straight by Jesus on this. He said, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it weren't so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and I will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I'm going. And Thomas said, like the rest of us, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you'd known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. You see, we can't come to a father other than as a child. And that's the invitation Jesus gives us. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to come to the Father through Jesus the Son. And he knows what it's like to be a child. We notice that? He knows what it's like. He knows what it's like to be a human child, but he also knows what it's like to submit as son to father. And so we're going to ask him to do what only he can do, because by the power of his Holy Spirit at work in us, even if right now you're thinking, I don't actually even know how to do that, Si, he does. Because he's been doing it since forever. And so he can help you. You see, there's stuff we all need to work out with this. And there's hindrances that we do actively. There's hindrances that we bring in passively. And none of us are perfect yet. But we are being made like him who is perfect day by day. There's no other solution to this than just to keep coming to Jesus. Have I said it enough times? And so we're going to do that. And I almost want to dare you this morning, like a kid. Dare you. I dare you. Come to him with the stuff that you've never brought to him. Share with him, and maybe share with one of us, the stuff that has otherwise kept you away from Jesus for ages. I dare you. See what he does. Because every time I've done that, he's never once let me down. And so I come to him again and again and again, and then I forget a bit about what he's like, and then so I don't come to him for a while, and then life goes to pot, and then I come to him again. And maybe you're the same. And so we're going to do that this morning. Can I ask us to stand for a moment?